Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and just to give kind of a little update from last week, my health is still not great, but I have at least a early plan kind of in place. So next week on Monday, I'm going to see my gastroenterologist, followed by next Friday, I am going to have an MRI. And the MRI is really where we're going to figure out exactly what it is that is going on and what the next steps are going to be. And this could go a lot of different ways. So the best case scenario would have been the medication that I'm taking would resolve this to such a point that maybe no additional intervention is needed. That is not going to be the case, unfortunately. So things were better for almost all of the end of last week. I was feeling pretty okay and thinking, okay, maybe I have turned the corner on this, and maybe it's going to be fine just with medicinal solutions. Not the case, unfortunately. And now we just wait and see what the doctors say. But I think the next most likely scenario is going to be a particular surgery that's going to be outpatient. It'll be a few days recovery at home before I can go back into the office, and then approximately 2 to 4 weeks of kind of additional process and follow-up visits, and you then hope that it takes care of the issue without some of the major complications that can occur with this particular type of procedure, none of which I care to share. But let's just say that the worst case scenario in that particular avenue of treatment, in and of itself, I'm not super looking forward to if I were to get complications. Worst case scenario is that what's happening is because of another issue. And some of those could, of course, be cancer. Always a possibility for a 50-year-old on-again, off-again smoker who has a health profile that leads me into a higher risk zone. So my own fault for not taking care of that piece when I'm thinking about the rest of my fitness. Like I got to be done with it. But anyway, the MRI will tell us everything that we need to know, and then I will have a plan. So this week's episode, on top of everything else, I'm actively parenting. And, my daughter always likes to bring up some interesting conversations at the most random of times. And usually it'll be 2-part conversations. What I mean by that is, first, a conversation with one of the parents, and then another conversation with the other parent. Now, some of those things may overlap, but usually one is kind of dipping her toes into the water. You know what I mean? Just throwing a little pebble in there to see little ripples. And then kind of takes that first conversation, depending on the feedback that she's receiving, of whether she's receiving it positively or negatively, and then kind of subverts it a little bit. And instead of just dipping a toe, just dives right in with, I think, an entire scenario that the first person would never have imagined that the conversation would have gone in the direction that it's gone. Like, wait a minute, we just talked about this the other day. What do you mean? That's not how it was presented to me. And I think that's really interesting. And because I grew up with a single mom, I didn't really have that kind of, go ask mom, she says no, go ask dad kind of scenario. I didn't have that experience. Like with a couple of things here and there throughout the years where I had a good report card. My dad let me go buy a knife. which I immediately cut myself on in the car. And he's like, you dumbass, I told you not to do blah, 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 you know? And I come home and my mom's like, you can't have that knife. And she confiscated my knife, and I could only get it when I went camping. Nice folding survival knife. Not a buck. I wasn't smart enough to realize that I should have gone right with the brand name, but Rambo was big at the time, and it had like the grip on it. Nice locking. Which, by the way, complete digression here, but my daughter, we were talking about, this is a different conversation altogether. We were just shooting the shit about like hobbies and kind of the stuff that she does with her boyfriend, which we're slowly coming around to. My wife, I think, really likes him. I'm kind of ambivalent about it because, you know, her last boyfriend was a total douchebag, and just trying to work through, okay, do we like this kid? He seems pretty solid and like supportive, and like they're supporting each other and having like conversations with each other that are far more mature than her previous two boyfriends. And I think part of that is age, but also being cognizant of the fact that a relationship is a two-way street and not just all about my daughter. Nevertheless, we're talking about different things they do. Like, you know, they've gone fishing and they've gone camping. Like his family goes camping almost every weekend. And, you know, she's been invited on a couple of those trips and, you know, got to know them, but also roughing it a little bit. Not quite. A little bit of glamping. Got to be honest. No hate. It's just, okay, cool. And I just jokingly said, oh, yeah, well, next thing you know, because they ended up doing like clay, like actually molding clay, like Ghost, I'm imagining. And I don't want to imagine that. You know what I mean? But, you know, something semi-romantic about doing clay together, I guess. But they're like being good kids and just like having fun and like doing kind of like the stupid shit that I remember doing with my long-term girlfriend from high school. And that was kind of like, we would do something fun like that, just completely innocent, innocuous, and just fun. And I said, oh, well, you should take up whittling next. And she goes, whittling? Yeah, I want to whittle. You know what I need? I need a knife. I need a knife if I'm going to whittle. And it's like, just like a little pocket knife. That'd be great. So I'll admit, I went ahead, and it's my daughter. And I looked online, and there was this very small Buck brand pocket knife. And then it arrived. I'm like, oh my gosh, this might be too small. Like too small, and it didn't have a nice locking mechanism on it. Now, mind you, I'm not expecting that maybe she's really going to whittle, but like if the blade doesn't lock properly, anyway, I'm just like, she's going to slice her freaking finger, this stupid thing. So I ended up buying, I ended up watching a bunch of videos on YouTube about knives. And there's this guy who's like, oh yeah, there's Rocky Mountain Knife Company, I think is the name of it. And I went and I looked at all their knives, and then I looked for similar knives over on Amazon, just because I want quick and easy. I ended up getting a second one, locking, nice Buck-style knife, and it was entirely too large. I'm like, holy shit. So now I have another knife. But anyway, she has this nice little Buck knife, slides right into her little clutch, and I can know that she has at least one weapon on her, and also her, you know, she has this defense thing on her bag anyway. So what am I babbling about? She's talking a lot about her high school experience. Now, all three of my kids have been through Catholic school, pre-K through 8, and then into a Catholic high school. Sacrifices have been made. I will tell you, it's not always been easy. It's not cheap. And we're not even at the more expensive schools in our overall market and geographic location. And she was kind of lamenting some things. Now, part of it is because she had a very bad breakup with a classmate. That brings with it a lot of baggage and shit, just being in school with friend groups and all that kind of stuff. But also her freshman year, she and her best friend, who have been like, they met each other in nursery school, like pre-K. They've been friends forever. Like they came and went in like middle grades and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, really all through like 5th through 8th grade, just thick as thieves. And they also had a couple of other friends that were in this group. And 3 of them in particular all went on to the same high school. And one of the girls kind of went in a different direction. And we all know that this happens. And it got very mean and it got very petty. And it was very difficult for my daughter and her friend. And she was talking about like just high school in general and these experiences and social orders and like how it breaks down and all this kind of thing. So I was thinking about this a lot. And I realized when we talk about things like the Brat Pack episodes, talking about the Breakfast Club and how we naturally kind of slide into these roles, whether we want them or we don't, and how little or how much it affects kind of our social relationships as we grow older as well. And I think that's kind of interesting because, you know, we have a lot of people that we may know that went off to college and completely reinvented themselves. And then for myself, I've always tried to kind of reinvent myself every couple of years. And I don't know exactly what it is about me. I don't know if it's a certain restlessness that I have, but it'll be like, okay, shave my head. Okay, grow my hair long. Like stupid shit like that. You know, oh, need a new tattoo. Whatever it is, I think that, you know, it goes back to my own experiences of having gone to many different schools when I was a kid, because we moved around a lot before we finally kind of settled in. And I thought to myself, what about the cliques of the 70s, 80s, 90s even? And, you know, what were they? And do we really relate to those kind of different groups and how we may have been artificially grouped into them, or just by happen of our interests and the people that we gravitated to and how those particular relationships were built? But also the fact that, at least for myself, and we'll get into this a little bit, I found myself kind of going through different versions of these. And I think one of the key things when we talk about this is the academic aspect of school in and of itself, and how that can potentially put you in a certain place. So anyway, why don't we go through this? So what was interesting is I found this article that was posted on some kind of blog, and it talked about cliques in schools, 1970s to 1980s. Now, I don't know really who this person is. Couldn't really find much else about them other than they have this kind of blog post. Her name is Jessica Martin, and I'm really not sure. I don't feel as though this is particularly accurate because there's language here that I don't particularly agree with. Some of the general categories I think are the same, but we'll start here because it specifically says 70s and 80s. And then we'll go to this other larger article that I was looking at and kind of looking at these different groupings and how many of them are predicated on what's happening in overall culture in general. So, of course, you have one group in particular that is universal, seemingly across generations, across geography. I think this one could even be potentially worldwide in some way or another, and that is the jocks. Now, the way that she wrote this, her words, not mine. This crowd consisted of the athletic-geared people in any school. Most of them prayed for scholarships if they wanted to go on to college. Most that didn't get them and ended up working in less than glamorous jobs. Jocks generally had their own events, athletic in nature, of course, and could be seen at the most popular group functions as well. Now, first and foremost, this is a very narrow view of all of these cliques that she mentions, because I think you probably all will agree. Jocks encompass people who are physically just capable and maybe less than intelligent, but also the kids who are top of their class, mind and body, like athletically gifted and academically gifted. And this is where maybe it's changed from the 70s and 80s, certainly late 90s, and I see it now. The student athlete is really looked at as being a student athlete. The kids who really, I think, get particular attention are ones who are knocking it out of the frickin' park in all of the key attribute categories that you would have in school. So next we have the outcasts. Generally, someone who didn't dress like everyone else was dressing and had little fashion sense, would easily fit into this group. This was the group with the most artistic inclinations and tended to be the type of people who weren't real interested in going to a kegger. This is terribly written, by the way. This group usually remained low-key It could go almost unnoticed. Unlike the nerds, this group didn't require academic performance to be of high standards. Usually, though, members fell into the middle of the road academically. And then they wrote though again. So I don't know where Jessica Martin fell, but it wasn't in the academic category, which might be why some of the language is interesting and her own predilections, perhaps, of the people that she went to school with. So next we have rappers. Now the rapper thing did definitely start in our era. It did. You definitely started to see the urban white boy. And growing up where I did, we had a number of kids who were white kids who were growing up in our housing projects who were very much the embodiment of, there's some terminology that's used for these young white boys that I won't use on the show, but nevertheless, some of them were real, is all I'm going to say. I can think of a couple right off the top of my head. And yeah, they were real ones. Like you didn't want to step to them. Let's put it that way. Because they talk here about anybody who doesn't grow up in the hood shouldn't talk like this without looking like a poser. We had one kid who was an absolute poser. Dad was rich as fuck, owned his own company, and he was acting like he was the baddest man on the planet. Ran into him a few years after high school. This rapper wannabe was a Grateful Dead dropout stoner hippie kid. Like, where did this come from? Started as a skater, then moved into rapper, and then into hippie. I don't know what that kid's doing now, but if he took over the family business, he's doing all right. That son of a bitch pulled a gun on me. Anyway, next we have the nerds, also known as the geeks. Disagree. Hard disagree. There is a difference between nerds and geeks. I will get to that in just a minute. Mostly filled with students of higher academic pursuits, they were generally lumped into one catch-all category. Some in this group could actually move into other groups, such as the popular group or the jocks, but could still be labeled as that particular group, nerds. Hackers, when actually at school, will fall into this group as well, since most tended to be academic. Generally, their outward appearance set them off from the rest of any group, since they were never dressed quite like the rest of the groups. Okay, so she mentioned a lot here. So this whole hacker thing, one of the other articles that I read talked about how, like, here she mentioned it too, war games, right? And how that movie War Games was kind of kicking off this whole concept of computer hacking. And there were definitely kids who were early users of computers. Now, I was one of them, but I never got into the programming piece all that much. Like really rudimentary, like simple, run, DOS prompt, little games that you could build. But nerds and geeks, this is how they're different. Okay. I consider myself a geek and not a nerd. Why? Nerds typically tended to be all academics all the time. Thought about the academics. I had to get an A. Go back to Brian in Breakfast Club and being completely concerned with, I need to have an A in every single class. Anything less is a failure. And their focus was solely academics, getting to the top percentage of the class, going on to a great college, career-oriented, that kind of mindset. A geek, someone who's more into memorizing pop culture shit, which is why I do this podcast, because I'm a geek for culture. And whether it was comics or movies or music, right? But there's other categories that fall within there. But I definitely think there's a line in the sand between geeks and nerds. Now, this one is definitely 80s. Okay, this was the Valley Girl. Now, I will say that the Valley Girl language did spread out across the country. Definitely there was people in the Northeast, in Connecticut, who would say things like, gag me with a spoon. Okay, absolutely, that language became a thing. Now, mind you, it was middle school for me when that language was kind of a thing, which didn't translate over when we went to high school, thankfully. But yeah, that was definitely a subgroup. Skaters. absolutely we had the skaters. Typically, there's someone who actually skates. Definitely true. And they did have some overlap in language with like Valley Girls, particularly like. And someone who's listening right now, I will tell you, we had a guy that we joked. His nickname was Like Man, because it was like man, you know who he is. Great guy. But every other word out of his mouth was like. One time in the car, like, holy shit, this dude just said like man, 9 billion times. And it was like a 15-minute car ride. Yeah, so definitely a thing. But those skater kids also would be in some of the other categories, like punk rock scene, hardcore scene, stuff like that, ska. And then we mentioned the hackers already. So I was less than impressed with this overall article. So now, just good old-fashioned Wikipedia. Now, what's interesting is that at the top of the page here, it says this article needs to be updated. The reason is, article is largely based on late 2000s and early 2010 conceptions of cliques. Okay? And, for example, the inclusion of virtually non-existent cliques that used to be prominent, like skaters. Okay? I don't know about you, but skaters are definitely still a thing and completely still on social media. Like, this stuff is happening. I know it's not the same as like definitely like late 90s, early 2000s in particular. You did get this explosion, particularly when a guy like Tony Hawk, who was only a couple years older than us, or he's a Gen Xer, but for me, a couple years older, and completely revolutionized that entire culture. So your BMX and your skater culture, I look at those as being overlaps. So to just say skaters, but you also had your BMXers, those kind of things. But here is what they say are some of the most common types of cliques. Jocks, cheerleaders, mean girls, foreigners, gamers, sluts, hipsters, hippies, arty intellectuals, gangsters, stoners, slackers, scenesters, punks, preps, skaters, goths, emos, skinheads, geek, nerds, athletic girls, just athletics, come on, cool kids, and drifters. Okay. Now, what's hilarious is that apparently this was from TLC. So TLC must have done some kind of TV show or something like that. But there's also a mention here of a Kardashians sociologists, Patricia and Peter Adler, claim that middle school cliques had 4 distinct categories. So we'll just very quickly do the middle school cliques. Popular. Members of this clique are generally known to have the most friends in their school and are viewed as having the most fun. Okay. The fringe group. Members of this clique follow in the shadow members of the popular clique, and they sometimes mimic the popular clique's actions, structures, and guidelines, but are not actually part of it. They are, quote-unquote, second in line to the popular kids. The loners. Members of this group seem to have very few friends and prefer to work and be alone. Some may be envious of those who belong to a different clique. And finally, there's this friendship circles. So members of friendship circles tend to be a group of friends who share a common belief, interest, style, appearance, or hobby, or are looking for their own culture separate from other cliques. The friendship circles can be divided into some general categories. Athletes. Members of this group play sports in or out of school. Nerds, geeks. Members of this group are studious and care a lot about their schoolwork. Some may be socially impaired. However, most have friends in the same group. They prefer video games, studying, and reading instead of playing sports or going to large social events. Punks, goths. Less so in middle school when we were growing up. I think it's much more common now. Probably because their parents were into that shit. Perfectly honest. Members of punk or goth cliques tend to have few friends and can be seen as violent or depressed due to their heavy use of makeup and dark clothing. This clique is less common in middle schoolers than it may be in high school. Oh, thank you. That's exactly what I was thinking. And finally, artists. Members of this group are very interested in arts. Okay. But let's get into the high school cliques. That's why you're all here. So you can look back fondly, or less than fondly, at your own high school experience and how you may or may not have been in one of these. So again, I don't like this geeks and nerds being interchangeable. This one actually has them separately. Okay. Geeks. A group of students. Excuse me. All right, so this one, is more aligned with what I was saying earlier, okay? A group of students described as being intellectual, obsessive, or socially impaired. They're usually depicted as nerdy and wear glasses and suspenders. No. Geeky interests and hobbies include fantasy movies and shows, role-playing games, and computer science. Geeks have a hard time socially as many teens view them as boring. Maybe. Jocks live for athletics, tend to be popular with their peers. Usually have a macho attitude and can be bullies. Can be. I didn't really ever have that sense, to be honest, except for one very small group of 1 year of kids that were kind of like that. Now, they use this term next, thespians, theater kids. What do you mean thespians? Just theater kids. The teens are obsessed with Broadway musicals and more likely to aspire to do theater professionally. They typically have a very busy and complicated schedule. Their preferred subjects are in the performing arts. Fair enough. Skaters, we've already mentioned them. Skateboarders who come along and borrow the long hair and slacker trappings to the surf scene, but they've always been more rebellious. Outsiders, also known as loners, may be socially challenged and unable to fit in, or they may be independent and feel no need to join any group exclusively. Now, we didn't have this term back then, but looking back, there were a couple of people who I would say fell into this category. Hipsters make a big effort to assemble an effortless-looking wardrobe. They challenge traditional norms and modern trends. We definitely had a couple of those in our school. Now, this one went out of favor in the 60s, but the greasers, right? You know who the greasers were. Leather jackets, jeans, cuffed, grease hair, pomade, vintage. Well, I mean, it's not vintage back then. It would have been like Converse, but apparently some greasers have kind of come back into the scene. Scenesters, also known as trendies. They are ever eager to fit in. No, because some scenesters were outside of the mainstream scene, right? It wasn't trendy. It was more that it was underground. So again, some of these terminology I don't particularly love. Preps, a subgenre of the popular clique. Preps tend to be good at being social and having fun and usually come from an upper middle class or upper class family. Sometimes they overlap with jocks, especially when it comes to sports. In most high schools, preps are the most commonly chosen to have important positions for school events such as class officers, extracurricular activities, homecoming king and queen, prom, etc. Maintaining the right image may even make them vulnerable. Unlike the stereotype of mean girls, preps often get along with everyone. Okay, so then we have nerds. They're obsessed and often have superior knowledge or devotion to something, usually aren't fashion conscious, may be introverted. They often do well in school. Mean girls, they always use like the Lindsay Lohan movie as this kind of like jumping off point of this being a label that kind of became popular. But honestly, it does exist. I just don't remember it being so glaring. I knew one girl that was like the embodiment of this, and I've like despised her from the time I was like 10 years old. She lived it her whole life. I imagine that she is the same way today, probably as a grown woman is a Karen. No offense if anyone finds that, term offensive. Sorry. But yeah, it's a thing. Now, this one didn't really exist for us emo kids, right? That whole thing was crazy. The hairstyles, I look back at some of our own styles back then, and this is just like, yikes. Very similar mix between punk and goth, and yeah, some of those millennial kids, high school, ooh, tough. Now this one is interesting, but we'll delve into it a little bit more in just a minute. So, rockers tend to stay away from the crowd in small groups with similar interests in music. This is a very large clique because of how diverse it is. They tend to wear band t-shirts, lots of jewelry, and are usually listening to music. Many of them will be in a band or know an instrument. They live according to the rock and roll lifestyle, sex, drugs, and music. It's real. And particularly in the 70s and the 80s, I am guilty as charged. That was the lifestyle. Like, it really was. Like, that was what I sought. And I love to play music. But there are other groups that kind of overlap with that, which we'll get into in a minute. And then finally, you have the drifters, also known as floaters, individuals that are capable of simultaneous interactions with one or more groups, non-exclusively, or being independent at their own accord. Okay. They don't demand attention, often opting to blend into the background to avoid any conflict or being labeled as part of a group. However, some usually don't mind being in the know with most gossips or rumors or learning things that no one else is aware of. Okay. So, with that being said, I look back at my own experiences, and it's almost like, how do I put this? When I first started high school, I had one person who I'd consider to be a really close friend. And our eighth grade outing, we got into a fist fight, like a real one. And I was supposed to go away with his family and, like, for the summer, like, head down to the Misquamicut in Rhode Island. I was disinvited. It was like done, and kind of pulled a couple of fast ones on me coming back to school. So I kind of didn't know where I was going to be. Like, where was I going to fit in this new high school environment? And I had long hair, had the mullet going on, but music, right? Music is kind of an international language. And I think that's where the whole rocker thing, it kind of piqued my interest a little bit. But the people that I first started kind of hanging out with in high school were actually the skaters. I was a very rudimentary, not very good skater, and never great at BMX and all those kind of things. But a couple of the lads, as they say, were my buds. And I mean, yeah, we back then you talked on the phone, you didn't text. I mean, a couple of them were like, my good friends. And then one of my friends from middle school who I'd known for years was in that culture as well, but started morphing into what we would know as emo, punk rock. But it wasn't until I had a girlfriend that we naturally kind of found our way to a group of friends. So not exactly nerds, because I didn't really care about school. If I got the schoolwork done, I usually did well. Great. Lovely. But my girlfriend was also a kind of jock, liked to play softball. Like, that was her sport. You know what I mean? So our group of friends were just kind of a mishmash of people that just happened to get along and watch a lot of the same movies, listen to the same music, those kind of things. And it was just a very natural kind of bringing together of groups. And then they gradually get a little bit bigger. And I was like, oh, well, we became friends with these people. And, then, hey, I met this person and met that person. And that was it kind of coalesced by, I want to say, sophomore year, fully, that this was our group and these were our friends. And by junior year, I break up with the girlfriend, right? And now, whenever you have a breakup, and this is no different than in our relationships as we're older, when couples split, it can cause kind of ripple effects in the friend groups. Well, now I'm single and I kind of start hanging out with like slightly different people. And by the end of junior year, started hanging out with almost a completely whole different group. So I guess you could say in some ways I was a floater, because I was never Mr. Popularity, never Mr. Cool. I was definitely the rocker guy, which meant that people who were into like metal, who might have been part of the popular crowd, found me easy to talk to or whatever. I was almost always sober because I didn't really like to drink. So it was great to have around. And the number of people that I've gotten home safe and sound just by virtue of not drinking back then, great. So it's just kind of interesting to think about how I've never really had one particular group that I fully identified with, you know? Now, ended up having my core group of guy friends. That didn't happen until like that late junior year into senior year, where it was the same group of us pretty much all the time. A couple other people that would come in and out kind of thing. But, you know, I can think of, let's see, like, I think it was consistently like 5 of us, sometimes 6 of us, and then like one other 7th as far as like the boys kind of thing. And it was interesting because I mentioned that there was that kind of that secondary group, you know, where you didn't, not the popular group, like that next kind of thing down. And a couple of the guys were kind of in that, but like some of them had been jocks and like decided they didn't want to do that anymore. And because they were listening to metal. One of my buddies was absolutely a jock, was absolutely kind of, you know, towards that popular thing, and made the gross decision, how dare he do this, of not wanting to play football anymore. So again, talk about like how you're defined by this narrow role that you're put into. It was, this is who you are. What do you mean you don't want to play football anymore? I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to take the abuse. I don't want to take the punishment. I'm not getting anything out of it. I'm never going to play in college. Why should I do this? I'm done. That guy who, I don't know, sometime around he went off to the military, like all of it, came back and started playing guitar. He is a professional musician. What? Because he always loved music. And that was the kind of connection point, you know? That was the connection point. And yeah, you know, it's funny. Now that I'm thinking about it, there was this whole other group too. And Carlos, you know who I'm talking about. This whole other group that we had that was very tight-knit as well. And that stayed even past high school for a few years. A whole another group. Like it's very interesting. It's like you had like this one little male group of us, but then when our wider circle, like we had this whole other group that was guys and gals that were just like a larger friend group that all just hung out. Yeah. But it's just so interesting how, I guess, I imagine that the people, and all of you are listening to this going, oh, I was a jock, and, you know, that was, you know, what I did and all those kind of things. And you're going to define it as I was a jock, but I was upper middle class. And it was always expected that even if I don't play in college, I am going to college, and maybe you're in the family business or whatever it is, right? And some of you might go, yep, I was a nerd. I was a nerd, and academics were everything. And that was what I put all of my time and focus and energy into, and got out into the world and doing well. And then there's probably people like me who had no sense of what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a musician, didn't want to put the work into it. You can go ahead and listen to the Lamentations of a Failed Rock Singer, available Stuck in the Middle podcast. Didn't put any of the work into it. I just wanted the wine, the women, and the song. Do you know what I mean? Like that's it. That was all that was important. Otherwise known as sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Like that was the life. And I'm like, oh wait, this is work. This is not all fun. Wait, I got to keep my voice in shape. I need to actually go ahead and take care of my instrument. Oh, really? You mean I can't just chain smoke cigarettes and hook up with some girl and do a ton of drugs and then be like fine for rehearsal? No. Made for some great lyrics. I got some great songs that are back in the old Rolodex, but it was like those kind of things. My social interactions were very similar to really how my life has been, which is just kind of going through and seeing what develops. And okay, now I'm going to go over here. Oh, sometimes feeling as though I'm not the captain of my own ship. Now, I am a man of faith. I've talked about that. My wife and I have been talking a lot lately about concepts of predestination versus free will. Not going to bore you with that. That could be a whole episode, but it's not for this particular show. So maybe on something else that I do at another time. But how much of what we experienced when we were growing up were we able to really control, right? Like a lot of the kids who would have been upper echelon, the popular clique, so to speak, many of them were legitimately from wealthy families, or at least upper middle class. That was not where I was from. Like that wasn't. I gradually became middle class, but not through any virtue of my own work. It was my mom getting remarried, moving to a different community, like those kind of things. But ultimately, we get kind of slotted into things even beyond our control. Sorry, if you show up at school and you're obviously in either hand-me-down clothes or things clearly from Kmart, which was my experience as well, even if other people weren't necessarily saying something directly or even tangentially, you definitely have this sense of, hey, I'm not fitting in with the kids who are in freaking 7th grade, whose entire outfit like costs more than like my bike. Do you know what I mean? Like there was definitely that piece of it too. So we do get cast beyond our own, maybe it's beyond our own will of this is who we are. This is who we've been determined by others as who we are. And I think that's why I've always been so prone to, different mindset for myself. And I think that's why I'll go ahead, get a new tattoo or shave my head, shave my mustache, whatever it is, these little things of, no, this is me being in control of my identity and who I am because of so much of external factors that play a role in who we become. This is really where it comes down to the conversations with my daughter and how that stimulated this whole talk about this topic tonight, is that she feels though so many things were beyond her control. And that means everything from, our first house was very, very small. And some of her friends, had families who were in little McMansions. Now, I can tell you, just by knowing some of them, there's some generational, maybe not wealth, but certainly a foot up. And that's really what we always talk about when we're looking at larger pictures of even the United States or like worldwide and economies and social structures and social engineering and all those kind of things, is that, there are different means that people come from. And I think that's more universal than not, which is why I hate that we're so divided as people along lines as this, because take this and extrapolate just social groups in high school and look at that in the real world application of whether it's a matter of along racial lines, linguistic lines, and obviously socioeconomic factors. Like all of these things, our society is built, and whether we like to admit it or not, because we like to believe the 100% in the American dream and the freedom of self-determination, but we do have a basic caste structure, and people are quick to go, we have to eliminate the caste structure in India. Everywhere has a caste system of some sort, whether we like to admit it or not. And to think that we as American citizens don't get slated into certain categories. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't move nimbly up or down. Certainly, I've had it with my own life and seen that, knowing what it's like to be with a single mom, single income, and what having a dual income family and being in a blended family in a more suburban environment versus urban environment, what that does psychologically, and certainly in terms of my younger sister, her social mobility and her relationships and how she was, kind of brought up and where she was slated in on this overall social stratosphere. My gosh, we couldn't be more different in that regard. Like her experiences in school and her presence in that school, completely different than my own. But part of that is born from the circumstances of growing up. So I don't know. It's just so funny. I just think about these people that I was friends with, and musicians and theater kids, a couple of theater kids, but then a couple of cheerleaders, and at least one or two people who were athletic. And then you have the kids who just, one of our friends, I'm not going to say his name because he doesn't listen to the podcast. Wish he did. I'd love to have him on. Such a great guy, but literally universally beloved by everyone. And if there was someone who didn't like this guy, there is something really wrong with them. And he could have been in any single environment, and everyone was like, we love this guy. He's just the best. And I was very fortunate to have been able to call him a closer friend than just a hey, he's here 1 minute, gone the next, where a lot of the people are like, hey, so-and-so, we're so glad you're here. And then, never talk to him. Yeah, I came across some really cool people in my life. And that's where a couple weeks ago, talking about it's such a bummer where, politics has divided people and those kind of things, because, the people who find you at these different phases of your life, particularly at vulnerable times, I think a high school experience or middle school experience is for many of us. Even these kids who are popular, who might have gone home and really been, may have been a mask for some other things that were happening behind the scenes. You know what I mean? And then some of them, I'm sure, were just dumb as a box of rocks and popular and rich and still doing great. The people who are not particularly intelligent enough to even doubt themselves, kudos to those people. I wish that I didn't have like this self-doubt that sits in the back of my head that exists all the time, which is probably part of the reason I don't do more of the social media stuff and putting my face out on the camera and those kind of things. Because there's this little bit of you that goes, oh, no one's going to like my content. But then also, oh shit, what if people actually like my content? You know what I mean? It's like the actual fear of success as well, which is definitely something that I struggle with. But yeah, where did you fit in on all this? Were you a jock? Were you a nerd, a geek, a punk, a goth, a rocker? Oh, rockers. Okay, this is another thing that I meant to bring up, where I started talking about like outcasts and those kind of things, because some language that I expected to find in one of these articles, and it didn't exist. Gearheads. Gearheads? You don't have that on here? On any of these? The kids who are into their cars, who are into shop? Some of those guys had trucks in high school. They were driving their pickup truck. A lot of them went off to the military, but they were gearheads. They worked on their own cars. They worked on their own trucks. They'd show up and you go, whoa, did you hear that? What was that? Oh, so-and-so just got a new truck or a new car. We don't even talk about gearheads in here. And they have different names and different generations, but gearheads is what I recall. But those were quite lined up with draggers. Do you know the draggers? We had draggers, the people who smoke cigarettes, who would overlap between rockers and gearheads, but also you'd have some preppy kid out there smoking a cigarette. Now, like many of us, in the 70s and the 80s, and I'm sure in the 60s too, you could get a smoker pass, go out at lunch, have a cigarette. In the morning, there was a certain place that we went, we had a cigarette. Certain parking lot out and back, have a cigarette. So draggers, like that was a whole thing unto itself. Oh, so-and-so's a dragger. That's how you knew someone was a smoker. It's just, it's just interesting. It really is interesting. And I really am fortunate to have met some really cool people who accepted me when I'm a pain in the ass. Like, I'm a lot. I'm not even going to deny that. I am a lot. And I got in a lot of trouble. I got a lot of trouble in high school, middle school too. I almost got tossed middle school more than once and was up against it a couple of times in high school as well. There was one point I had a good 2-week stretch of just getting suspended. And they were like, yeah, we're not going to do out of school suspension. You're going to do in school suspension. That's a bummer, dude. Really? In-school suspension. Like, we know you want a vacation, brother, and you're not going to do any of the makeup work. So guess what? You're going to sit in this little square room right in the main office. It's a little prison room. It's like one of those rooms that you have in the interrogation rooms in a cop show. And they sit you in there, and you got your classwork. At one point, I had like 2 free periods, which meant I had no new work being brought in. I put my head on the desk. Someone would be in. Put your head up. No phones, no computers, just a room, a notebook, your books, and you look at the light and you look at the wall and you're like tracing the block with your finger, just going, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in here all day. Because they didn't want to give me out of school suspension. Kudos to them. That's a good move. As a parent now, I'm like, pretty savvy. Don't just let them go home. That's vacation. Bullshit. And then I will share this with you. So this is why I talk about nerds and geeks, right? And it's like different things, but also kind of a rocker. And then, just also a little bit of a, I wasn't a drinker. I'll just say I wasn't a drinker. It didn't mean that I didn't have fun. And it got to May. Gosh, was it April or May? And literally all of my teachers were like, dude, you are set to graduate. You are a reasonably intelligent human being. And you've done nothing this entire term. Nothing. And if you want to graduate like a month away, you have to do this. All of this. Like immediately. And you're going to have to take all your finals and you're going to have to pass them or you're not graduating. This is a month out. I didn't go to school much the last term and a half. And so not a nerd because my academics, I could have cared less at that particular time. I got on my final term, so 4 terms, right? Semester, quarters, if you want to call it that, right? 4th quarter of my senior year of high school, I had an F in every single class but one. You have to imagine that through my junior year, I was in the top quarter of my class. I was now at the halfway point, right? I dropped 25%. Like I dropped down that many. I was like middle of it. And the only class I didn't get an F in was Italian, which was an honors class. And I got a D, which grade point average, because it's an honors class, meant it was equivalent to a C. And then I did okay on my finals. I actually aced a couple of finals. I squeaked by high school. So if there's any wonder that I went and did a whole paltry 2 semesters, 2 years apart at community college, where I got like an A, a C, and an F. And then the other term, I don't even know if I finished anything. Why I didn't go back to school until I was 27 years old. Then became like, for the most part, a straight A student and graduated with honors from my bachelor's program and got a master's degree. But, yeah, it was an interesting time. 80s into 90s, a lot of partying, a lot of good times, a lot of good people. I think if I have to categorize myself here, it's either a rocker, a geek, and at points an outsider, at points, I guess, just a drifter or a floater. Probably more of that than anything. But yeah, let me know. Where did you fall in your school's hierarchy? I would love to know. And how can you do that? You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, share, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.